We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
The grievances we could go into with this system, I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today we're talking the SEC conference governance, and there's a lot to unpack here. The SEC spring meetings are happening right now. Greg Sankey's been on the record talking about this. Kirby Smart, who historically hasn't really concerned himself with traffic rules in Athens, has said that if they can't find rules to play by, that everyone plays by, he thinks they should break away, and their conference is strong enough to go out and play. So, with that being said, why do some of these coaches and administrators want the SEC to make their own rules as opposed to follow NCAA governance?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just the SEC in this standpoint. I mean, I think if we're looking at kind of current events and looking at a lot of different things, the SEC is very much like a lot of people within the SEC are kind of pushing for this at this point. But there's been talks about it, about this in Big Ten meetings as well, just all across the board. And the reason I think is ultimately pretty simple. I mean, the biggest issue that college sports faces right now is antitrust law. Those magical two words that we've talked about in, I think, basically every episode that we've had. Antitrust law, of course, prevents, restraints on, market-wide restraints on unreasonable restraints, I should say, on commercial markets, including labor markets. So NCAA rules that, across the board, across the entire NCAA, restrict athletes' abilities to, have mobility, to have economic freedom, to be able to make the full value of their labor, are going to be heavily scrutinized under the law, and in many cases, as we've seen, potentially get shut down, potentially have courts say these aren't legal anymore. But antitrust really only concerns itself and really only needs to concern itself with market-wide harm. When you have the entire NCAA making rules, that's the entire college athlete labor market. But if you just take individual subsets, if you take individual conferences, and you have the SEC itself saying, we are going to impose and heavily restrict the salary cap, we're going to have transfer rules between, even if it's not punishing people from, for coming from the Big Ten, even if it's like between the SEC, that's generally seen as fine. That's generally not something that antitrust law is going to concern itself with, because antitrust law is all about competition, and it's not across the entire market. A player who doesn't like the restraints that the SEC imposes can say, okay, well, I'm going to go to Ohio State or Indiana instead. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that's a big reason why we're talking about it, is because, like, for example, we saw just a few months ago, there was a case out of the Second Circuit where this appellate court affirmed a district court decision to dismiss a case against the Ivy Leagues. The Ivy Leagues, of course, famously in Division I, they do not offer athletic scholarships. And these athletes said, well, wait a minute, this is a market-wide restraint. You are collectively agreeing to all of you not give athletic scholarships. You're not competing with each other, where one of you may say, oh, I want to give an athletic scholarship. So they filed a lawsuit. They said, this is a unique market. This is a specific kind of thing, because these are, particular universities, or the Ivy Leagues. They're special universities for high academic performing, students. But the court said, well, wait a minute. I mean, you still can go to Stanford. You could still go to Rice. You could still go to Cal. You could still go to any of these other high performing schools and get an athletic scholarship. It's not controlling the entire market. So the same principle would likely apply to the SEC.
I got two-part question here for you, Sam. One, let's say that the SEC did create its own rules. Mm-hmm. In its simplest form, they'd have to leave the NCAA to do that, correct? And then two, if they were to create their own rules and be their own entity, why are the rules under a single conference governance structure not subject to the same scrutiny as a market wide? I mean, I hear a little bit of what you're talking about, but you might need to dumb it down for me a little bit.
Sure. Well, for the first question, would it be something where they have to leave the NCAA? I'll give the law professor answer and say it depends. But it really does depend, very specifically in this case by, are they going to impose rules that conflict with NCAA rules? If the NCAA steps in and says, well, wait a minute, you're allowing more than we allow, then yeah, the SEC would have to break away. They'd have to try to get some kind of exemption from the NCAA, do whatever kind of along those lines. But if they're doing things that are the NCAA rules kind of allow, then that's totally fine. It's like minimum wage laws, for example, where across the country we have the Fair Labor Standards Act. The national federal minimum wage is $7.25, but states can and very often do impose higher minimum wages because it doesn't conflict with the law. So I think the NCAA would probably take a similar kind of similar conflict type of thing, where it's like, does it actually conflict with our existing infrastructure? Is it something where by following SEC rules you'd be breaking our rules? And for your second question, kind of why it wouldn't have the same scrutiny, it's all about that competition. It's all about, are you actually restraining, do you actually have monopoly power? I think it's a big part of it, because like if you look at like monopoly, I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about antitrust law. If you think about the game Monopoly, for example, the goal is to have all the different properties, right? And by having all the different properties, you're able to charge higher and higher prices. That's kind of the whole economic idea behind monopolies, where you don't have competition, so you could basically do whatever you want. And that's what antitrust law really tries to avoid. Similarly, if it's a group of parties that are all coming together to collectively in some way own a bunch of these properties. But if you have all these different competitors, you have to compete with each other. You can't necessarily stand on your own and say we're going to charge the highest prices and have the lowest quality, because what happens if you do that? You go out of business, because your consumers, your customers are going to go to other businesses. And the same is true for labor. If you say, we are going to, despite all the competition we have, we're going to pay the fewest amount of salaries, we're going to have the least amount of benefits, we're going to impose these, highly restrictive non-compete clauses on you, nobody's going to want to work for you. So, they're going to go to your competitors instead, and you're again going to go out of business. So that's what antitrust law really tries to protect, that competition. And when you have the SEC and the Big Ten who are competing with each other for labor, the internal schools, even if they are individually, or even if the conferences are coalitions of different buyers, those two coalitions are still competing with each other. So there's going to be competition between them, where an athlete can choose. Hypothetically, if the SEC has more restrictive rules in the Big Ten, the athlete can choose to go to the Big Ten instead.
But what we're really talking about are restrictions that the SEC does not want to be subject to under NCAA guidelines, which means if they're going to create their own governance structure, they're likely taking their ball and going home. Potentially for sure. I think what they want more than anything, though, I think what we're kind of hearing, and, I think opinions can vary on whether they actually mean it or not. What it sounds like they want more of is enforcement. They don't feel like the College Sports Commission is doing enough to enforce the rules of the House Settlement, for example. They don't feel like the House Settlement's actually, doing what it's supposed to do, which is imposing this revenue sharing cap and enforcing this revenue sharing cap. And frankly, they're right. So I feel like they think that, because obviously there's kind of this looming threat behind the College Sports Commission, behind the House Settlement, that, things I've said many times in this podcast, parts of it very likely violate antitrust law, even if it is a settlement. I mean, settlement is not a collective bargaining agreement. It doesn't have that broad exemption. So they feel like doing something that better conforms with an antitrust law, where it's doing it themselves, is the path to go. At least that's the theory.
It's a cop-out. It's a major cop-out to me, because it's you ask the question, why would the administrators and the coaches want this? It's because they can't govern themselves. It's because they cannot help themselves. It's because the easy answer to all of this is, if you're worried about escalating prices and not knowing if you have enough recurring revenue to be able to cover those in the future, and thinking that your rosters are going to get 20% more expensive year over year over year, you're admitting that you can't say no. You can't be the one to say, no, we're not going to pay that price. You're only willing to say, no, we're not going to pay that price if you know all your peers and all your competitors are also going to say, no, we can't pay that price. The only way you can accomplish that is by colluding. So the only way you can collude legally is if there's enough competition in the market to allow a certain group of people to collude. They've determined that the NCAA at large can't collude. They can't do that. That's against the antitrust rule. All the courts have told them that. Maybe if the SEC colludes amongst themselves while allowing the Big Ten to operate how they want to and the ACC and the Big 12, then maybe the SEC gets to collude and not actually go out and have to make a hard decision about what prices they can and can't pay. So right now, what they're asking for is the ability to say, all right, well, the NCAA can't govern us. We can't govern ourselves. Can we reduce the size of governance and figure out if the SEC can govern us? Can Greg Sankey tell us what we can and can't do? Because the NCAA can't, because every time they try to tell us what we can't do, we push the boundaries of it anyway. And anytime that gets curtailed, it gets brought up in a court, and it's like, well, you can't actually set the rules anyway. So the SEC goes out and breaks the rules, and now they're asking for somebody else to enforce the rules that they can't hold themselves to. And here we are.
With that, I mean, is that simply put, the only reason they're considering this a salary cap? Is there any other rule that they would like to be different, in your opinion?
I'm sure there's others. I'm sure there's roster limits. I'm sure there's, but almost all of it comes back to salary cap circumvention if it's not the salary cap itself. So they're all birds of the same feather.
Yeah, that's basically what they're complaining about mostly. I mean, if you see the context of the vast majority of these quotes, the vast majority of the, maybe we need to have our own kind of governance structure. It's always surrounding, kind of the escalating player salaries. It's surrounding the idea that the College Sports Commission is doing not much of anything to do it. And also the fact that, a lot of these deals, kind of paradoxically, a lot of these deals are getting rejected by the CSC, which is, again, very, very, very much a paradox. But hey, what are you going to do?
I admittedly am not real optimistic about the future of college athletics. Some would call it negativity, and that might be fair. But
the glass is half full.
Let's start with a beacon of positivity here, silver lining. In this scenario, is there any potential good to be found with conference governance?
Well, I talk about collective bargaining a lot, and I got to assume collective bargaining would be a lot easier within one conference versus, the entirety of college athletics. I'm also not hopeful that that would come to fruition because the SEC's, my understanding, heavily in favor of the SCORE Act, which prevents, student athletes from being classified as employees. And that probably gets in the way of a lot of these collective bargaining discussions. So I don't know.
Well, to your point, I mean, I think a lot of these discussions are premised around the fact that, well, the SCORE Act is dead. And again, it's been dead before. Doesn't mean it can't come back, but the SCORE Act is not happening right now. It might not happen ever. As we're taping this right now, it looks like we're going to get the Cruz Cantwell bill today. Whether that, what that actually looks like, I think, we have some inkling, we have some kind of guesses, but we also kind of, it's been reported that it's not going to include a prohibition on employment. So that could potentially lead to collective bargaining. I have some personal issues with, reducing the leverage that athletes would have before collective bargaining. But that's on me. But I think it's also telling that as we're listening to a lot of these conversations at the SEC meetings, we also had an article written by Ross Dellinger talking about, hey, a lot of these, they're having conversations about collective bargaining in these meetings right now. They are discussing collective bargaining. They're looking at that as a potential solution, or they're looking at the pros, cons of it. They are not ignoring that aspect of it, especially now that federal legislation, to the extent that even if we say it could happen, it's going to be pared back significantly, and it's not going to be the SCORE Act.
Positives. I've talked before about how when we first talked about congressional action and what could potentially come of it. I had mentioned the opportunity to prop up Olympic sports and to maintain a pathway for those. And I think that in a roundabout way, single conference governance could allow for that, could allow for, maybe a certain conference becomes sort of the powerhouse of Olympic development. They could prioritize that. They could choose to make that an option for themselves. The SEC has kind of said that in some way about how they feel like, being their own boss will allow them to protect those things as well that they also deem important. Not sure how much of a red herring that is or if that's real, but I do think that is a potential positive outcome, whether it's the SEC that becomes that Olympic development conference or not, is not really relevant to the fact that if they're governing themselves, everybody could choose kind of their place in the market and what they want to be best at and how they want to compete. And that could be an outcome is that people, some conferences could prioritize Olympic sport development. They could prioritize, any which way you want to talk about it. They could choose their own way to do things. So you could have more of an appetite. Whereas right now, we talk about it from a competition standpoint. When you look at potentially incoming freshmen and the new cohorts of college athletes, they could have kind of options to choose from of where they want to be, what they want to align themselves with, how they want to do that. Whereas right now, pretty much everyone is competitively making the same decision to try to chase football glory. And that has, some larger scale impacts that maybe could be mitigated if you have different conferences governing themselves differently.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. I think that's probably in the hypothetical, and I'm going to premise this heavily with in the hypothetical. I think that could be a positive here where if you do in the hypothetical have, do what Kirby Smart is saying. And, he also talked about in his comments saying, the spending that we're doing on college football is going to end up hurting the other sports or killing the other sports. I'll point out the irony that he's the highest paid coach in college football, but again, we're talking about the hypothetical here. You could have a salary cap. You can limit spending, and you can put the spending that, the tampered down spending, you can put all that back into your Olympic sports, make sure those can continue to be funded, continue to thrive. But that's kind of a house of cards when you think about it, because you're premising all that on the idea that the SEC is going to be okay with having their spending be significantly reduced. And, it ultimately it is, it's the prisoner's dilemma, because the SEC is not going to want to do it if the Big Ten is not doing it. And if the Big Ten is not going to do it, if the SEC is not going to want to do it. And then you're getting back to collusion. So,
well, now that we've had a good positive outlook on this, now we put our energy vampire hats on and tell me why there might be downsides to this concept.
I mean, this takes me back to like the old professional wrestling days where everything was regionalized. So eventually, okay, so they break off, do their own thing. And then, out in the West, you've got your own, regional alliance, and those eventually all come back together anyway. So play this out 10 years down the road. I mean, break this out and then it makes sense for everybody to get back together again. Like I don't know. There's a lot of negatives here that are go way beyond that. It's the erosion of college sports as we know it. Like that's the biggest negative for me.
Yeah. And Joe, I think if you look at every professional sports league, it's uncanny how every single one of them went through a period of consolidation. They did not go through a period of separation. They went through a period of consolidation. The NFL merged with the AFL. The American League merged with the National League after colluding to kill the Federal League, thanks to the Supreme Court and National League for Baltimore Orioles, or not Baltimore Orioles, Federal League Club of Baltimore, different. The NHL merged with WHA. The NBA merged with the ABA. Like, the trend is always towards consolidation, because you can't have two separate sports leagues or multiple different sports leagues that are competing in the same sport, because there's going to be contract comping. There's going to be, fighting over players. There's going to be, a race to the bottom in terms of restrictions, because you don't want to be the more restrictive conference. You don't want to be the more restrictive sports league. You don't want to be the one who's saying, well, we're only going to pay you this amount, because the player is just going to say, okay, well, I'm just going to go to the other league then. Because that's what happened in every single one of those other leagues. You had fighting over players. And that's exactly what would happen here. there is no world aside from collusion, which brings us back to square one and, brings us back to another antitrust case where it's like, okay, well, even if the SEC and the Big Ten are saying that they're operating separately, are they actually operating separately? If they do have very similar restrictions, if they do work together to, tamper down transfers and all that. If we don't have any of that, if we have actual independent kind of rulemaking in between those conferences, it's going to be the same to race to the bottom. And the salary, whatever salary cap the SEC can enforce, if that's what they're actually looking to do, it's going to be exactly what we're seeing right now, which is it's not going to be enforced. It's not going to be followed. And we're just going to continue to ramp up spending. We're going to continue to be paying these players a lot of money because competition, that's what competition does. That's exactly the purpose behind the antitrust laws. Like it's not like this is not a way to kind of cheat the antitrust laws. It's doing exactly what antitrust law intends you to do, which is have competition. This is not a, this plan is not a, here's how we're going to beat antitrust. Antitrust beats you.
I think that, looking at the schools, the conferences, the individuals involved, as far as what the downsides are, the obvious one is that if you went this route, you lose the NCAA as your scapegoat and you don't get to blame them for all the transgressions and the lack of enforcement and all the other things. You got to look in the mirror. And, the old Jerry Tarkanian quote about, getting so upset at Kentucky that they punish Cleveland State again. There's no Cleveland States in the SEC if you're governing yourselves. And if Alabama's on a title run or LSU's on a title run, is Mississippi State going to get the brunt of some, enforcement to send a message and prove a point? I don't know. I mean, you kind of, I don't know. There's much less separation of church and state when you've got the conference that is so heavily invested in the success of the institutions, being the one governing the institutions. And I think that it opens myriad issues that could come about from that. But losing that sort of like collective villain of the NCAA, I think, is probably the greatest downside of the schools and conferences going out on their own.
So to be clear, according to Mike Walsh, Mississippi State is the Cleveland State of the SEC.
Oh boy.
Just so all the Bulldogs fans know that.
I mean, who would you say is if it's not Mississippi State?
I was also thinking Mississippi
That's
State.
tough. Yeah, tough.
Well, their softball team just beat Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Hey, they're in the World Series. They're looking really good. Maybe that's why they're top of mind. Didn't mean it offensively.
But if we go back to breaking it off again, I mean, Iowa State's AD said, if you're going to take your ball and go home, you're taking all your sports. And so when I talk about the erosion of college athletics as we know it, I'm talking about you're having different titles and all of these different sports. And, I don't care if it's gymnastics. I don't care if it's, take the basketball tournament. That's one of America's favorite pastimes. And if you take the SEC and possibly the Big Ten out of that, and now we're at 116 teams in the NCAA tournament, and those don't include either of those two conferences. And there's a national champion over here, but we've got a national champion. Yeah, the world championship. They give them belts. Go back to the WWE example. And I'm not a wrestling guy either. I don't know how I know all that, but
someone's watched the Hulk Hogan documentary.
I did.
Recently.
That's what I got. I watched Hulk Hogan. That was great. And that's where we're getting on all these different separate deals. And to your point, everybody consolidates again at some point anyway. Like we're gonna deconstruct this, knowing that we're gonna have to reconstruct it. And maybe when we reconstruct it, we'll actually have some regionality back to all of these conferences. Who knows?
Well, it's funny because as you're describing that, I'm thinking, isn't that just what we had, in the bowl system, like before the BCS? Like we had, and at least in football, we didn't have any kind of tournament. We just had, we're going to vote we're all going to play separate bowl games, and we're going to vote at the end of the year as who the national champion is. It's going to be decided by the AP, which brings us back to where we are again now, I guess.
Yeah. Another tangent on sports journalism and the quality these days, meant for another time. But Mike, you kind of touched on it. If say this happens, you're the SEC, why would you be motivated to uphold your own standards? And to your point, if you've got a team making a title, are you really going to punish them because of the revenue lost by not having a title contender.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't want to claim that I know exactly how it would go down. I think there's a lot of, just like our conversation last week, the economics are a little unclear on this so far. So it's a bit of a guess to say exactly how the economics would work in a single conference going out and like just, being their own market essentially, in this assumption that they wouldn't be violating antitrust. Because anyway, I don't know that. I don't know that we know enough, to be really honest with you. I think that, it remains to be seen how much negative economic impact a conference would see by punishing one of their front running schools. Long-term, short-term, I don't know how that looks. I think theoretically, if the league as a whole is strong enough and they believe they're strong enough and their contracts are strong enough that there isn't a negative impact, then you could threaten that sort of revenue loss for the schools, and that would be why they would potentially follow the rules. But just like we've talked about so many times with the NCAA, the schools are the members make the rules, and the conferences, I think that's still kind of where you're at until you've got some sort of third party that is serving as the arbiter. But no one's talking about that. I think the schools still want to be able to make their own rules. They just want to be able to do it in a way that they're able to make rules together that is defensible in court because they're not subject to antitrust.
And the funny thing is, when you ask the question, the first thing I thought of was the SEC is going to follow the rules until the Big Ten wins 3 straight championships. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Who's won the last 3 championships? I think there's kind of an inherent paradox here where the SEC, they want, or at least they're saying they want, this enforcement. They want, this revenue share cap to be enforced more clearly. They want to tamp down on runaway spending, but what they're complaining about is the Big Ten. I think in large part, obviously they're competing with each other as well, very much so, for the same recruits and doing that kind of thing. But, I think there's a lot of, complaining about, well, how much did Indiana spend? How much is Ohio State spending? How much is, all these schools in the Big Ten, how much are they spending? And even if they are strictly talking about themselves, them imposing a cap on each other, doing the single conference governance thing that we're talking about, that's not going to change the Big Ten unless they're colluding with the Big Ten, in which case, well, there's probably other problems there. I mean, do we know that, maybe the SEC and the Big Ten, come together and have this big super league, but the bigger you get, the more antitrust problems you have, the more potential of antitrust problems you have. Or maybe as the Big Ten and the SEC, you can argue that, well, we don't control the entire market because we have the ACC and the Big 12. But I think the bigger you get and the more you consolidate the highest levels of it, I do think there's a sophisticated plaintiff or maybe a state attorney general files a lawsuit and says, you are actually a separate market, like the elite, like as you've kind of positioned yourselves to be, you are now the market for elite college football. And by controlling that entire market, by merging, by consolidating, by colluding between the two of you, that's a violation of antitrust law. Even if you leave out the ACC and the Big 12, because you're leaving them out of kind of that elite college football conversation.
I would also just say every rule that's ever been written in the NCAA rulebook was written because somebody found a way to go against it. It is an example of a way that someone did something that the rest of the body said, no, we don't like that. And that's not going to stop. If the conference are the ones writing the rulebook, it doesn't matter if it's an NCAA rulebook or an SEC rulebook or a Big Ten rulebook, that will continue for the end of time. So they're going to keep finding way. It doesn't change a whole lot. It's just a matter of whether or not they can get away with it.
We've mentioned the Big Ten. That's always kind of been the common thought, is those two conferences might split away at some point. But as their own entity, does the Big Ten, do any of these other conferences have the same cachet as the SEC to even be having these discussions?
I think the Big Ten does. I think that that's probably where the conversation ends. I think if you look at, if the Big 12 were to split away and do their own thing, I don't think, with all respect to the Big 12, Boise State's a member of the Big 12 at this point, at least for beach volleyball. I just don't think they have, as you said, the cachet to be able to do this in a way where it makes sense, where they would have the power to be able to, for one, I mean, yeah, it goes back to the who you're competing with kind of question, which is if the Big 12 wants to be this entity that, is, has this national champion, well, nobody's going to take that seriously because you're not competing with the Big 10 and the SEC. If you're not competing with the Big 10 and the SEC, and if you are, then you're competing with them in terms of labor. And if you take actions to, more strictly enforce rules, it goes back to the same problem where if you're the only one who's strictly enforcing these rules, you're going to be left behind.
All right. Related to Joe's favorite topic, you brought it up already, collective bargaining. Sam, from your perspective, if this were to happen, Ross Dellinger has mentioned that the idea of collective bargaining is picking up steam. Why is it picking up steam now when, to Joe's point earlier, that was not really something the SEC seemed interested in earlier in this process?
I think it's very much tied to the demise of the SCORE Act because, I think all along we've talked about there are two paths to getting antitrust exemption. Well, there were three. One of them was the courts, and after Alston, that's not happening. The second would be going through Congress, and with the SCORE Act dying, with a lot of questions about whether this new Cantwell and Cruz bill A does what you want it to do effectively, or B even has the juice to even get through Congress, which I think, looking at the past 6-7 years of congressional lobbying by the NCAA, it's a very strong bet to say that it's not. Like if I was a betting man and were to place a bet on this, I would probably put my life savings on no, because that's just what we've seen over the past 7 years since we started having these conversations when California passed their NIL law in 2019. So that leads one path. If you can't get antitrust immunity through the courts, if you can't get antitrust immunity through Congress, you do it again, well, to a certain extent through the courts, and you do it through collective bargaining. But collective bargaining doesn't work necessarily on a NCAA-wide scale. For one, the NCAA is adamantly against it, which means, if you go to that single conference governance, if you say, we're going to do our own thing, you could do your own thing and do it in a way where you facilitate collective bargaining. Obviously, still, Gabe Feldman had a quote in the Dellinger article, program director at Tulane in the sports law program, very apropos quote, which is, well, management does not get to decide whether collective bargaining happens. The players do. The athletes do. Labor does. There has to be unionization. And maybe you do something to facilitate that. Maybe you voluntarily recognize a union. You educate your players as to the benefits of a union, which would be very ironic, but labor law or collective bargaining and unionization tends to work significantly, much, much differently in the sports context than it does in traditional labor, which is the subject of a lot of law reviews that I've read and very much enjoyed and gotten a lot out of. Because, there's a lot more incentive for sports leagues to collectively bargain. And I think we're seeing that now with the discussions that we're having.
I think you touched on it. I believe there has to be a recognition at this point that if you don't take matters into your own hands and start this process, the rules are going to continue to be defined for you. And I think that's, that's the crux of all of this. They do not like the rules that are being defined for them.
That leads into our final topic of the day, our unilateral decision. We're not talking necessarily if it's good for athletics or bad at large, but if you're Greg Sankey, your job is to elevate the SEC. So if you're in his position, do you go ahead with moving on from NCAA governance and bring it into your own? If so, to what extent do you do that?
You want me to kick this off?
Go ahead.
I hate that this is my answer, but my answer is yes. I do. I'll put my, my rose-colored glasses on too. I would hope that, we're going to do this, but we're also going to do it as a model, and the rest of you guys can completely jump on board with us so that we can all stay intact. And I know that's not exactly what we're talking about, but if they're able to do it and say, come join us and here's the model and it works, like, and everybody's back in, I think that could be good for everybody, because I do think you could go the collective bargaining route and create a set of rules and do all of the things that everybody's been talking about resolving. But if I take the rose-colored glasses off, I'd be very careful about how I was going about this. We just saw Live Golf, and if you're gonna jump at the opportunity to either make more money or do everything completely differently, you got to be very careful that you're not doing it in a manner that, 5 years later you're coming back with your tail between your legs, trying to rejoin what you left.
Great point.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Joe said. In fact, all of what Joe said. I shouldn't say a lot. I think I do it if I'm Greg Sankey, which this is probably why I'm not Greg Sankey. I think I do it if the goal is to facilitate collective bargaining, which there's something of a paradox there, because the reason why you do collective bargaining in large part is, and it's not only because of this, but one of the big carrots, if we're kind of talking about the carrot and stick of labor law, one of the big carrots is the antitrust exemption. The idea that you can have collusion with not only with kind of this multi-employer bargaining unit, but also with the players themselves, and be able to set rules and be able to set enforceable rules. And that goes way beyond antitrust. But, if, the large goal is antitrust, kind of antitrust evasion here, then again, it's a little paradoxical to do it as a single conference, because, well, the idea behind a single conference governance is to avoid antitrust law, even if as I mentioned earlier, that's not really how it works. But that's at the end of the day kind of what my thinking is that if you're doing it because you think that, if you're doing single conference governance because you think this is how we can enforce our rules and get around antitrust law and be able to do it on our own, that fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of antitrust law, because antitrust law is going to beat you there because you have competition. You are leaning into the idea that you don't have antitrust enforcement because you have competition, but that means you have competition. But if the goal is to break away and say, do it in a way that where you're facilitating collective bargaining and saying the NCAA is being far too restrictive they're being far too conservative and restrictive, and they're not going to let us do this if we stay with the NCAA. We want to be able to declare athletes employees. We want to be able to allow them to collective bargaining. We bargain with us. Then yeah, I think that's a reason to do it. But again, if the goal is we're going to do single conference governance to evade antitrust law, it's not going to work.
I agree wholeheartedly, and that's I wanted you guys to kind of speak first because I think you set the table for it. I completely agree, and to me, we've talked about it before. We talked about it in the congressional episode, a few weeks back. This is a time that requires actual and true leadership, and actual and true leadership means operating in the best interest of the organization at large, and not just what's best for you and your friends because it's best for you and your friends. And I think that, to both of your points, Sankey and everybody else in the SEC has an opportunity right now that they could choose to make a decision that is for the greater good. And they could choose to break away if they're choosing to break away, or at least create the model of what breaking away would look like. If they're choosing to do so as a way of saying, this is how we can set up a greater future for college athletics as a whole, we're choosing to do the work, do the hard work to show you guys what it could look like for there to be employment, for there to be collective bargaining, for all these things to work together. And if this is a model you're willing to follow, come with us. We're going to go do this together. And if it's a bridge too far for any schools or conferences or anybody else, then you guys can kind of sit together and figure out what the future of the NCAA looks like. And we can sort of do these things differently. And, maybe there's a way that they work together when it comes to national championships and things like that. But I do think that, to both your points, to Sam's point about if this is your, yes, I would do it if the goal is to create what the future can look like, and understand that you are doing it because you have the cachet and the ability right now to go out and be the leader of the group and figure out what this can look like for everybody else, not to take your ball and go home, but to create a way that says, all right, we think we've identified it. We think we've figured it out. Anybody who wants to come with us, the Big 10, the Big 12, the ACC, if you want to come with us, let's use this as a framework. Let's go from here. Let's figure out if we're all okay with it. And this is a model how it can work. And anybody who doesn't want to join, the NCAA still exists. We did this in a way that we could all, coexist and everything could be together. But if the answer is yes, we're going to break away because we just want to be able to go set our own rules, do our own thing, and take all of the TV revenue that everybody else has also enjoyed over the years, it's the wrong reason. And it's not what college athletics or anyone in this country needs right now, is leadership in being able to actually make a decision with other people in mind that benefits other people and not just yourselves. And they have an opportunity to do it right now. So if I was in his shoes, I'd figure that out. But if you're figuring it out because you just want to make sure your piece of the pie is the biggest, then you're not doing it for the right reasons.
Fair enough. Well, the times, they are changing. They'll continue to change next week, and we'll tackle that then. All right, well, that does it for this episode of Unilateral Decisions. We'll see you next week.